We have a little acronym for thinking about dynamic intelligence. Dynamic problems are messier than static problems, right? Static problems are just, idealized things that always have a right answer and everything works well and everybody always says the right things and, gives you what you want and everybody loves you no matter what you do and, that's it. But in the real world, we're dealing with what we call multiple, ever-changing, simultaneous, surprising, imperfect, emotional, and relative attributes of our world. There's a real world dynamic example for you. Okay, so multiples. Right? In the real world, you're managing multiple goals, demands, problems that are competing for your attention. Right? You're always involved with multiple roles. Right? You might be a parent, a child to a parent, a brother or sister, sibling, a supervisor, a supervisee, right? All at the same time. And the world, of course, is ever changing. Real life problems, relationships, conversations, and daily life in general is continuous change. Right? I like to point out that we're dealing with, in an ever-changing world, we're dealing with having to make continual course corrections. Right? That's actually a sign, a type of intelligence is not setting out in the right direction, but knowing that when you set out in the direction, you're going to continually have to make changes if you're going to get to a goal. Anybody here sail? Well, if you watch the person who is, captaining the sailboat or whatever ship, what are you watching them doing? Constantly. Yeah. Can you hold the rudder straight and get anywhere? Or the sail straight? No. As opposed to a powerboat, by the way. Well, you're still making some corrections, but you really, if you were like just going out into open water, you probably wouldn't have to. But in a sailboat, it doesn't matter. The thrill of sailing is that you can't possibly ever be exactly on course, can you? Right? And you're dealing with multiple variables that you have to look at. The wind, right? The current, the depth, temperature, other boats and things that might create a wake for you. And you're constantly making adjustments. Interestingly enough, each adjustment you make is throwing you off course in a different direction. It doesn't put you on course. It actually, if you think about this sort of zigzag, throws you off course. If you think about real life as more like sailing than like a motorboat, you'll really understand dynamic intelligence versus static intelligence. Of course, there's lots of different simultaneous problems that you have to deal with, but communication is one that stands out in autism. The biggest problem with communication in autism is all the simultaneous processing, not just the simultaneous channels, but the idea that there's something coming from you and me, and my perception, your perception, my idea, your idea, that we somehow have to simultaneously integrate, along with all these different channels of communication. Right? All that has to be combined into one packet. And it keeps changing moment to moment. It's very complex, actually. The amount of integrated processing that you take for granted is enormous. You just take it for granted. And so when we start working with someone with autism, we have to realize that we have to build that up. And of course, the world is surprising. Right? The idea that you can wake up in the morning and assume that everything you planned is going to work out like you expected it to be is ridiculous, right? And you don't. I mean, you hope, but you also aren't shocked when unexpected things happen. You might be annoyed, but you're not freaked out. And what's important is that you don't get a lot of warning often when changes occur, do you? They just happen. And one of the concepts I like is, anybody read the book The Tipping Point? It's a nice way to describe dynamic systems thinking, actually, nonlinear thinking. And if you want to read it, if you're confused by dynamic thinking, it's a good book to read because you can obviously read it like a novel. And what it describes is the concept that things could be accumulating under the surface, changes, problems, difficulties, and be almost at a point where they create a breakdown in everything. But because they're just a little bit below that point of breakdown, the system is still functioning just fine. But all you have to do is add a little bit of grain of sand, a little bit of tiny problem to reach what we call a threshold, and everything falls apart. And there's a sudden cascade into chaos and crisis. And often our lives are like that. A lot of us live near that tipping point. We live in a lot of stress. We don't give ourselves a lot of slack, and we sort of make it, and then of course one event happens, and we feel like everything's falling apart. But on the other hand, of course, if you take the surprise out of life, it becomes sort of hardly worth living, doesn't it? But if surprises are all seen as catastrophes, as they are for people with autism, then they are to be avoided. You wouldn't want to avoid surprise. We use a term that we call productive uncertainty. That's an RDI term. Not every, a lot of people, uncertainty is a term that gets talked about in developmental psychology, all of psychology. Human beings require a certain level of uncertainty in order to thrive, grow, and develop. We know that. If you minimize the uncertainty, they stagnate. If there's too much uncertainty, then they're just overwhelmed. And so for all of us, there's a productive level of uncertainty where learning, where growth, development occurs. Uncertainty being defined as the distinction between what I know at this moment in time or how I understand my world and make sense of it and what I'm being faced with, right? And again, if you're never challenged like that, then you just become basically mindless. You don't grow. But if it's too much all the time, it's just overwhelming. And of course, the world is imperfect, isn't it? That's the I in M.E.S.S.I.E.R, right? We're getting to the last three letters, right? You're always having to you only have so much in the way of resources, right? If you try to do everything perfectly, you wind up doing nothing right? So you're always having to juggle and say, what is good enough? How much effort should I, I'm taking notes, how much effort should I put into my spelling and my grammar, my handwriting, versus trying to understand, versus how much should I spend trying to write down every word he says, versus to stop and think about what he's saying, even though I might lose a few words. It's a juggling act, isn't it? And in that juggling act, you're dealing with an imperfect world, which in some ways I call it a imperfect perfection. Because by making those compromises, you're actually creating an optimal state, right? Or you're trying to. Whereas if you try to be perfect, you'd create a disaster. You'd have this perfect handwriting and spelling, and you'd have nothing to show for it. How many mistakes do you make every day? It's interesting if you ever try and help somebody who's a perfectionist to just start showing them, keeping a diary of your own mistakes and demonstrating how many you make. I did that once with a kid, and I got up to 2,000 mistakes in a day with this real perfectionistic kid. He said, Dr. Gutstein, you're in bad shape. I could never make that many mistakes, no matter how hard I try. You're a big mess. But it was, of course, very helpful for him to perceive that, because realizing that mistakes are things that are just going to happen in the world. Okay, so just like any other skill, when you're first learning to drive, mistakes are inevitable, right? It's my pictures from my learning to drive period. And of course, the world is emotional. You cannot separate emotions from cognition. Look at some of the real life problems. How long is enough to study for a test? When you were in college, let's say, how did you know when you had studied enough? The idea that it feels like I've mastered. It feels like I'm ready. I feel ready. What does that mean? I feel ready. Well, what it means is you've grown up. I mean, that's just a normal thing, that you don't separate the cognitive from the emotional. And, when we do, it becomes really weird. My mind tells me to do this, but my feelings tell me to, we do that all the time as if we really could separate them out. And that's not true. It's just a little artificial game we play for ourselves. My mind tells me I should marry him because he's making me good. But my gut says, blah, blah, and you can't separate them out. They're together. They're one thing. An adult I know very well had this real problem because she couldn't make this integration. It was interesting in terms of living in a remote. She was very sad, about like 103 fever, and we happened to be speaking, and I was worried about it. And the woman on the spectrum, I said, "Why don't you go to the doctor?" She said, "Well, I don't know if I've been sick enough days to go to the doctor yet, because maybe you need to be sick more days, like maybe 10 days before you can visit the doctor." And it's interesting how, most of you would just say, "I'm sick, I'm going to the doctor. I feel sick, I feel like crap." She couldn't get out of bed, but she was trying to act like, there was somehow, she had to figure this out as a cognitive problem. And it's interesting that she couldn't use the emotion to make that decision. My favorite quote about this is this one. That's a true quote. You all know Star Trek. And of course, they represent this dichotomy in the original Star Trek, which is funny. And then the Star Trek, the next version, the next generation, you have Data, who's just fighting, which is interesting. It's evolved to the point where now you have the emotionless android. Now he's an android, Data, who is doing everything he can to feel feelings, to have feelings. And it's his greatest desire in life. It's interesting. And then you have the captain. It's interesting, Picard, and the next one, who's very cognitive and very, and sometimes denies his emotions, but they always come in and his first officer is more the emotional one, so they reverse it. But it's interesting how that evolves. That whole theme evolves. You just can't separate the two out. And of course, Spock always has to deal with his emotional side, whether he likes it or not, because he's half human. And of course, the world is relative. That's our R for M.E.S.S.I.E.R. The meaning of the information is only going to be determined by examining its relationship to other information. To a 4-year-old, an 8-year-old is a big boy. When can I grow up and be like him? If you live in Easton, Texas, a 40-degree day is considered extremely cold. Matter of fact, you probably don't want to go out. Too cold. 40-degree Fahrenheit for you Canadians. So, of course, here's winter in Cancun, and here's winter in Edmonton. But they're both winter. M.E.S.S.I.E.R, and this is a good acronym if you want to think about it. Right? Multiple, ever-changing, simultaneous, surprising, imperfect, emotional, and relevant. That's the world. That's the real world. Unfortunately, that's also a good way of thinking about the deficits of people with autism spectrum disorder. But it's not a matter of black and white. Right? You could probably define the severity of autism by at what point in this process does that particular person's processing break down. Right? Somebody who has a milder form of autism can probably handle more of this, right, than someone who has a more severe form where even the slightest bits of any of that cause a breakdown in processing. Okay? That would be actually a nice way to define it. We don't, but it could be. So again, it's a spectrum, right? It's a continuum. So people can say, well, I know that person at work, and they must be autistic because they have trouble with some of these. That doesn't mean necessarily they're autistic. The question becomes, and it really becomes difficult to say at what point do we call it a disorder, right? Well, if you think about it, you call it a disorder to the extent that it disorders you. To the extent that you can't get employment, to the extent that you can't get married, and, well, getting married is not the key. Staying married, and having a decent marriage. That you can't, be part of your community and your culture, right? And so there's not going to be an absolute place where you're going to say, okay, that's a disorder and that's maybe what we call more of a shadow syndrome or some version of it. Because a lot of people say, well, there must be all these autistic people out there who are undiagnosed. Well, there may be, but there may not be as many of them as you seem to think. Or not you, but some people seem to think. Because, you can, like a lot of engineers and geeks have maybe some of these on some levels, but yet they're not in a pathology, they're not disordered. But we have to really think about quality of life. What's getting in the way for this person? How is this person not able to have a quality of life at their point in time?